When King Charles rose before Parliament that morning, no one expected the words that would ignite a royal firestorm and bring the nation to tears, "My true heir." But whispers of betrayal, heartbreak, and defiance had already been swirling behind the palace walls, feeding the tension now thick in the air. From the moment dawn broke over London, the atmosphere had felt heavier, charged with an electricity that neither tradition nor routine could suppress. Parliament convened as it had done for centuries, yet the collective breath of those assembled betrayed their unease. Reporters lined the gallery, their pens poised and cameras flashing, already sensing that today would be different. Eyes darted between William, Catherine, and Camilla, all seated prominently, their presence far from customary for such an occasion. William's expression was unreadable, a carefully constructed mask that gave nothing away, while Catherine sat gracefully by his side, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Yet it was the queen consort who drew the most attention. Camilla's discomfort was palpable, her jaw clenched, her posture rigid as though she could scarcely hold herself together. Speculation had already reached a fever pitch over the past week, newspapers screaming of a rift between Charles and his family, rumors of secret meetings and hushed arguments echoing through the palace corridors. Leaks to the press only fueled the fire. Anonymous insiders hinted that something monumental was coming, something that would change the course of the monarchy forever. Some claimed Charles was preparing to announce his abdication. Others whispered of a shocking betrayal about to be exposed. But even those wild theories failed to capture the truth of what was about to unfold. Among the crowd, Harry and Meghan sat quietly in the back row, their presence as unexpected as it was provocative. Meghan whispered something to Harry, who nodded without lifting his gaze from the front. Their appearance alone spoke volumes, a signal that this was no ordinary family affair, but a confrontation waiting to erupt in full view of the world. As the chamber settled into silence and Charles stood at the podium, all eyes fixed upon him, searching for answers in his solemn expression. The weight of decades of history seemed to press down on his shoulders as he cleared his throat, his fingers gripping the edges of his notes just a little too tightly. And though everyone sensed something extraordinary was about to happen, no one, not even those who thought they knew him best, could have anticipated that Charles would shatter centuries of royal protocol with just 3 words that would reverberate around the world. When Charles finally spoke the words, "My true heir," and pointed to William before Parliament, gasps filled the chamber, and a silent rage settled over certain faces in the room. But what led to this moment of public reckoning? The weight of it all hung in the air like a storm about to break. His trembling hand, slow and deliberate, rose and pointed directly at William, a gesture that silenced even the whispers that had been buzzing moments before. Murmurs erupted almost instantly, but they were cut off by the crack in Charles' voice as he struggled to finish his sentence. Every syllable felt like a confession and an accusation all at once, spilling into the hushed chamber and echoing through history. Camilla's face froze into something cold and unreadable, her composure failing for just an instant before she blinked it back into place. Meghan leaned into Harry and whispered sharply, her words too soft to hear, but her expression etched with something that looked almost like satisfaction. Around them, members of Parliament exchanged incredulous looks, caught off guard by the king's breach of centuries of royal decorum. Some glanced at one another, as if silently questioning whether this was planned or whether they were witnessing an act of rebellion against the monarchy itself. William, at the center of it all, stood motionless, caught between pride and a burden so heavy it nearly bent him where he stood. His chest rose and fell, as if he were forcing himself to breathe, his eyes flickering to his father and then to the crowd. He looked both exalted and trapped. A man handed both the throne and its 1,000 sharp edges all at once. Even Catherine, by his side, tightened her grip on the bench, her knuckles white as she caught his gaze in quiet solidarity. Meanwhile, outside the ancient walls of Parliament, the press erupted into chaos. Journalists scrambled over each other to report the words that were already lighting up headlines around the world. Phones rang in frantic hands, reporters shouted into cameras, and social media flooded with disbelief and speculation. The world, it seemed, was holding its breath and gasping at the same time. What Charles had done was more than a proclamation. It was a challenge, a reckoning, and a wound ripped open before the eyes of the world. Yet this was not just a symbolic declaration, it was the culmination of a bitter battle fought in the shadows for decades. What the cameras didn't see were the betrayals and secret meetings that drove Charles to this dramatic proclamation and the scars it left on his family. Long before the words, "my true heir," left his lips, quiet wars had been raging behind closed doors, each one cutting deeper than the last. For years, Charles and Camilla clashed in hushed, venomous arguments over William's role in the future of the monarchy. Camilla, emboldened by her growing influence, argued that William should wait his turn, that the crown was not yet his to touch. But Charles grew weary of her dismissive tone, his patience fraying as she pushed to prioritize her own family's ambitions over the future of the throne. Private documents uncovered later hinted at his growing dissatisfaction with palace advisors as well. Memos, laced with frustration, described his dismay at how decisions were made in his name, yet ignored his wishes. He believed the very people entrusted to guide him were quietly undermining him, bending to Camilla's suggestions while sidelining William and Catherine at every opportunity. Those quiet doubts festered into a quiet rage, a seed that would one day bloom in Parliament for all to see. Meanwhile, Catherine moved in her own quiet, deliberate way. Every smile, every engagement, every careful gesture in public was a chess piece placed with precision. She became the anchor that secured William's standing, winning hearts and influencing key allies without drawing the ire of those who opposed them. Her strength came not from loud declarations, but from an unshakable presence that no rival could ignore. Behind her calm exterior, she was laying the foundation of William's claim, stone by stone, and Charles saw it and approved. But in the shadows, resentment brewed. Harry, already feeling exiled from the inner circle, began to see every move as an act of exclusion. He lashed out in private, accusing his father and brother of treating him like an outsider, while Meghan whispered that he deserved more than scraps of respect. His bitterness seeped into every interaction, making reconciliation feel impossible and feeding the divide that Charles no longer had the energy to mend. Anne and Edward, unwillingly drawn into the conflict, tried to play the role of peacemakers. They urged calm, warned against rash decisions, but their words fell on deaf ears. They were left watching helplessly as the fractures deepened, powerless to stop what was coming. And in the background, whispers grew louder that Camilla was quietly orchestrating a campaign to install her own relatives in positions of power, preparing a new dynasty that bore her name rather than his. Charles, at first incredulous, began to see signs everywhere: the invitations, the sudden promotions, the growing boldness of her inner circle. The betrayals were no longer whispers but daggers he could feel pressing into his back. And yet, the deepest betrayal was not from enemies but from within Charles's own heart. As Charles delivered his historic words, his eyes betrayed something deeper, the anguish of a father grappling with his own regrets and failures. Beneath the regal mask he wore for the world, something fragile flickered, and for the first time in years, the weight of his private sorrow became impossible to conceal. His fraught relationship with William since Diana's death had been a silent wound, growing more painful with each passing year. The distance between them was not just measured in miles or words, but in missed chances in the moments when pride had eclipsed love. He had watched his son grow into a man both strong and hesitant, burdened by the same crown that had haunted Charles himself. And yet, he could never bring himself to simply say the words William had so desperately needed to hear: "I am proud of you." Behind the palace walls, where history and duty often eclipsed humanity, Charles wrestled with guilt not only for William, but for Harry as well. Private letters later discovered revealed a man torn by remorse, confessing his shame at how his youngest son had been pushed to the margins. In ink stained by sorrow, he admitted that he hadn't known how to be both father and monarch, that he'd let palace politics smother the boy who only wanted to belong. Every line was heavy with unspoken apologies, and yet the rift between them widened all the same. In quiet hours, long after the corridors had emptied and silence claimed the palace, Charles confided in the only person who dared speak to him plainly, Princess Anne. Together they spoke of the monarchy's future, of how it might endure if only it could shed its arrogance and remember its people. Anne had warned him that time was running out, that he could no longer pretend the family was whole when fractures ran so deep. Her words stayed with him, haunting his thoughts even as he stood before Parliament. And how could he forget his mother? Queen Elizabeth's voice still echoed in his mind, urging him to protect the crown at all costs, to hold the line even when it meant sacrificing himself. Yet what did it mean to protect the crown if the family beneath it crumbled to dust? The secret fear that had haunted him of leaving behind not a dynasty, but a battlefield now pressed against his ribs like a blade. And so, with tears brimming, he confessed at last, whispering what he should have spoken years earlier, that he should have acted sooner, that his silence had cost them all more than they realized. But even as he bared his soul, powerful forces within the monarchy were already conspiring to challenge his declaration. If Charles thought his words would bring unity, he was mistaken, because Camilla's quiet fury erupted into a storm no one could contain. The moment his trembling hand pointed to William and the declaration was spoken, her rage began to smolder beneath the surface. At first, she sat frozen, her eyes fixed on him with a look that could have shattered glass. But the silence between them didn't last long. As the chamber erupted in murmurs and Parliament began to descend into chaos, Camilla rose abruptly, her chair scraping behind her as she stormed out of the hall. Eyewitnesses would later claim they'd never seen her move with such force. The air around her charged with something darker than humiliation. It was vengeance in its rawest form. Behind closed doors, away from the eyes of Parliament and press, she confronted Charles in private chambers. Her voice, sharp and unrelenting, cut through the walls as she shouted, "You've destroyed everything." The words echoed not just through the palace, but through the hearts of everyone within earshot. This was not simply about succession. This was about power, pride, and her fear that William's ascension would mark the end of everything she had built. Every ounce of influence she'd clawed from the shadows now threatened to slip through her fingers. But Camilla was not alone in her fury. Behind the scenes, a network of allies who owed their positions to her began to stir. They whispered threats of leaking damaging information about the royal family to the press, secrets too explosive for even the monarchy to survive unscathed. These were not idle threats but calculated moves, designed to remind Charles that his public declaration came at a cost far greater than he might have imagined. Her own family, including her children, allegedly urged her to fight back. They reminded her that her position, her legacy, was now at stake, and that surrendering would mean erasure from history's memory. Those whispers fed the fire already raging in her chest, convincing her that she had been betrayed not only by her husband, but by the institution she'd once defended with unyielding loyalty. And so she vowed bitterly, and without hesitation, to never forgive Charles for what she perceived as the ultimate humiliation. Not in private, and certainly not in public. Her voice, low and venomous, carried through the halls that night, as she made it clear she would stop at nothing to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. And as Camilla plotted her revenge, William and Catherine quietly prepared for the next chapter, a chapter fraught with its own perils. For William and Catherine, being named the true heirs was no simple triumph. It came with dangers, doubts, and a heavy crown. The weight of his father's words still echoed in William's chest, but as the applause faded and the cameras fixed on his face, a quieter truth began to sink in. This was not just a title, it was a battlefield disguised as a throne. In the hours that followed, he wrestled with his own unease, torn between a sense of duty and the nagging fear that he might not be ready to shoulder what lay ahead. Beneath his poised exterior, there were moments when the weight nearly broke him, moments when he wondered aloud to Catherine if he truly had what it took to lead, or whether he would be devoured by the very institution he was about to inherit. But Catherine stood steadfast at his side, her resolve as unshakable as the crown itself. She understood better than anyone the political minefield they were about to step into. Her calmness was not naivety but deliberate strength, a silent vow to guide William through the chaos. She knew the whispers would grow louder, that allies and enemies alike would test them, but she also knew they carried the legacy of a queen who had faced similar storms and endured. It was that memory of the quiet courage of Elizabeth that Catherine clung to as they prepared themselves for the battles to come. Yet even their children felt the burden, though they could not name it. They were too young to understand the full gravity of the moment, but the glare of cameras and the scrutiny of the world clung to them all the same. Every smile became a statement, every frown dissected, every gesture questioned. The family, united on the surface, stood under a microscope that magnified every crack. In private, away from the pageantry, William confessed his doubts. "Am I ready?" he reportedly asked one night, his voice low and uncertain. He stared at the floor, as if searching for an answer he already feared. The silence that followed was heavier than any crown. But Catherine, refusing to let doubt win, reminded him of what his grandmother had believed, that the monarchy's strength came not from perfection but from endurance. Together, they resolved to honor the Queen's legacy, to fight for the institution not as it was, but as it could be. And though they wore calm expressions in public, their hearts knew that opposition would rise, and that loyalty was a fragile thing, easily shattered by ambition. It was Princess Anne who offered them a final warning, her voice quiet but laced with certainty. This isn't over yet. Indeed, it wasn't over because one final revelation was yet to come, one that would send shockwaves through the monarchy. Just as the dust began to settle, a confidential document from Queen Elizabeth's vault was leaked, and it revealed a truth more stunning than Charles's speech itself. For months, perhaps even years, whispers of a secret will had circulated quietly through the corridors of the palace, but no one dared to speak of it aloud, fearing the upheaval it might bring. And now, at the most volatile moment in modern royal history, its existence was confirmed. At the center of the storm was a private codicil to the Queen's will, a final, hidden directive that left no room for interpretation. In language as clear as it was devastating, it named William as the rightful successor to the crown. Advisors close to the Queen had reportedly kept the document hidden, locking it away to maintain the delicate status quo. They feared that revealing it too soon would tear the family apart before Charles even had a chance to rule. But their silence became impossible to justify after Charles himself uncovered the will only days before his fiery declaration in Parliament. According to insiders, he had stumbled upon it while preparing his own papers, and the words he read in his mother's familiar script left him shaken. The language of the codicil was striking in its simplicity, yet devastating in its finality. To secure the stability of the realm, my crown shall pass to William. That single line became a weapon, a blessing, and a curse all at once. For Charles, it validated his instincts, but also made clear just how little trust his mother had placed in his ability to unite the kingdom. For William, it was a burden he could no longer deny. Camilla's reaction upon learning of the will was as fiery as it was immediate. She reportedly demanded to see the document herself, and when she did, her fury could not be contained. Those close to her said she accused the late queen of betrayal, crying out that her decades of loyalty had been dismissed with a single line of ink. Her rage reignited her determination to fight back, and she threatened to make public every secret she had kept for the monarchy if her position was further eroded. In the wake of the leak, legal advisors scrambled to interpret the codicil, debating whether it carried the full weight of law or was simply the Queen's final wish. The palace, meanwhile, descended into chaos, with factions forming, loyalties shifting, and silence no longer an option for anyone. What had been a family conflict was now a constitutional crisis, playing out under the scrutiny of the entire world. Yet, even as the monarchy reeled from this revelation, another unexpected player stepped into the fray, threatening to upend everything. In the midst of turmoil, Harry emerged from the shadows, making a last-ditch effort to reclaim his place and his father's favor. As the monarchy staggered under the weight of revelations and betrayals, few expected Harry to step forward so publicly, so boldly. Yet there he was, outside Parliament, flanked by flashing cameras and a restless crowd, his voice quivering as he pleaded for reconciliation. It was raw, unfiltered, and unlike anything the royals had ever allowed to unfold in the open. "I have always wanted to belong," he began, his words cutting through the noise, "but you all made sure I never could." He did not stop there. What followed was an emotional accusation, spoken as much to the cameras as to his family, watching from behind palace walls. "William," he said, his voice catching, "was always the favorite. He was everything you wanted, and I was what you endured." The crowd gasped, reporters scribbled furiously, and for a moment, the monarchy's carefully constructed image of composure cracked completely. His pain, long buried, erupted into full view, and there was no turning back. Yet not all the whispers surrounding his return were sympathetic. Leaks to the press soon suggested that Meghan was staunchly opposed to Harry rejoining the royal fold. Anonymous sources claimed she warned him it would only bring more humiliation, that the same family who had turned their backs on him once would do it again. The tension between them spilled into the headlines, feeding speculation about whether Harry was acting alone or whether he was already paying the price for his desperate gamble. The public, for their part, was bitterly divided. Some praised Harry's vulnerability and courage to confront centuries of cold tradition, while others called it a spectacle, another blow to an already fragile institution. The monarchy's supporters scorned him as ungrateful, while his defenders painted him as the only one brave enough to tell the truth. Inside the palace, Charles reportedly watched in silence, his expression a painful blend of grief and resignation. Those present later recalled his hands trembling slightly as Harry's words played out on a muted television screen, the weight of a father's failure laid bare for all to see. He neither spoke nor moved, but his eyes betrayed a torment deeper than anger, a sorrow that words could not mend. And then came the moment the cameras caught, but the microphones missed. William and Harry locking eyes outside the chamber as their paths crossed. There were no words exchanged, no gestures of brotherhood. Just two men staring at each other, their icy stares saying more than any argument could. But the storm was far from over because Charles had one final, devastating truth to reveal. With the world watching and his family divided before him, King Charles stood one final time to speak the words that would echo through history, words no one saw coming. In the days following the chaos of his declaration, silence had hung heavy over the kingdom. The corridors of the palace had grown colder, whispers more dangerous, and questions louder. Yet Charles did not retreat. Instead, he returned to Parliament, the weight of the crown and the wreckage of his family etched into every step he took. This was not a man defeated, but one determined to finish what he had started, whatever the cost. As he stood before the chamber, his voice was firm yet edged with an unmistakable emotion, a rawness that no royal facade could mask. He reaffirmed William's position without hesitation, naming him as the rightful heir and declaring that the future of the monarchy lay with him. But then came what no one expected, an apology. He turned his gaze to Harry, acknowledging the wounds inflicted upon his youngest son, and his words softened as he admitted his own failings as both father and king. The chamber held its breath as he then addressed Camilla, his voice breaking ever so slightly as he conceded the pain his decision had caused her too. It was a moment of rare humility, a monarch admitting he could not heal the crown without first healing the family. And then, his tone shifted. He declared solemnly that the crown must endure beyond our differences. The words rang through the hall like a bell, a stark reminder that no matter how deep the fractures, the monarchy itself must stand above them all. This was more than a plea, it was a command, delivered not just to his family, but to every soul in the room, to every citizen beyond its walls. In that charged silence, William rose, his expression unreadable, and walked toward his father. Slowly, deliberately, he bowed his head in a gesture of respect and acknowledgement. It was a powerful moment of unity, fragile and fleeting, but enough to spark something in the room. For the first time in days, the tension cracked just slightly, and Parliament erupted into thunderous applause. Yet beneath the roar of approval, there lingered something more subtle, a quiet unease, a sense that not everyone was willing to embrace this fragile truce. And so, as the dust settled on a monarchy forever changed, the question lingered in the air. Could this fragile peace hold, or would the shadows rise once more? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.